Well, we've now left our biblical ash heap, and we're going to return to the European world and embark on an examination of Stoicism, a philosophical school that arose in Greece and proved to be very influential in Rome. We're going to see that Stoicism is going to share some features with each of the positions that we've looked at so far. With the Gita, it's going to share a concern for coming to terms with our own finitude in an infinite cosmos, with a concern for controlling our emotions and for accepting the inevitability of death. But we're going to see that the way that this works out in Stoicism is very different from that it does in the Hindu tradition. It's much more temporal, not nearly so transcendental. We've surveyed three ancient traditions now, the Hindu, the Aristotelian, and the Hebraic. And as I've emphasized, they're very different from one another. The Hindu tradition emphasizes individual duty, freedom from attachment, unity with the universe, and the knowability of reality. Aristotle, on the other hand, emphasized our social nature, the importance of the cultivation of individual virtue in a moderate, happy life of rational understanding and human activity. The Abrahamic tradition emphasized our limitations, our inability to understand the universe, our inability to know the will of God, and our need for a certain kind of humility. So now we turn to an important Hellenistic tradition. This is a tradition that was so important in Greece and Rome, the Stoic tradition. And we're going to see connections to the Gita, but also to Aristotle. And those, of course, are not at all accidental, since Stoicism arises in the wake of Aristotelian philosophy. Let's begin with a brief outline of the Stoic view of life before we enter into an analysis of a few important Stoic texts. The Stoics argued that all of our knowledge is based in sense perception. That's the foundation, the things that we see, hear, smell, and so forth. But that knowledge is always amplified by reasoning, that we go on beyond what we ordinarily just see by drawing inferences and by using logic. And the Stoics were extraordinarily prolific in advancing logical theory. They argued that the universe is an entirely physical thing. There's no second spiritual substance, but that it is fundamentally a rational place, that it's comprehensible, and that the universe itself is intelligent, that it's a physical thing with its own kind of intelligence. The Stoics argue that the universe is designed by a rational deity called Zeus, and that Zeus permeates that universe. So in this sense, it's not unlike the view of the Hebrew Bible that the universe is designed by a deity and permeated by it. It's a theistic system. And just like the Hebrew Bible, the Stoics thought that the deity involved, Zeus in this case, is remarkably unconcerned with us. He doesn't really care about us. But unlike the viewpoint that we saw in the book of Job, this deity is immanent. He's right here in the universe, not transcendent of it, and he's rational. He has reasons for what he does. Reason, the Stoics argued, is always an exercise of freedom. And in that sense, we see a quick link to the Gita, this need to be free in order to be rational. Only the deity, though, is completely free and perfectly rational. Our rationality is a kind of fragment of that divine rationality, and our freedom, hence, is limited. We're free only insofar as we're rational. Aside from free rational acts, the universe is entirely causally determined. It's a mechanism. So the only way that we can transcend a mechanistic life is through rational action. Stoics thought about us that we, just like everything else in the universe, are physical objects. We're animals. As physical animals, we're subject to emotions. And the Stoics emphasize that emotions come upon us as passions. The word passion means something with respect to which we're passive. They happen to us. They're intrusions from outside. And here we see the same idea in the Gita, right? That when we experience perceptions or emotions, they come upon us and enslave us. But, the Stoics thought, we can control our emotions if we exercise our reason and if we get them under the control of reason. Emotions themselves are irrational. The onset of an emotion is just like any other physical event. Just as when I put my hand in front of my eyes, I'm caused to see it. When something happens and I'm caused to be angry, that's a straightforward causal event. So emotions come upon us, but they still involve choice, because we have a decision to make when we experience an emotion. That is, do we accept that emotion and act on it, Or do we set that emotion aside and not act on it? Our highest nature is our reason. And so the thing that we ought to be doing if we're going to lead a life in harmony with that higher nature, with that reason, is when we experience emotions, to try to set them aside. And a great deal of Stoicism is about gaining this freedom from emotions. Just as in the Gita, we try to achieve a kind of freedom from being bound by sense perception. The Stoics also agreed with Aristotle that we're first and foremost social animals, and that it's very much part of our nature to live in societies, and that many of our natural tendencies are determined by this. They emphasized that we have control over our internal lives. Reason gives us that freedom. We have the choice whether to act on an emotion or not. We have the choice about whether to perform a particular action or not. But because of the causal determination of the universe, the external world is outside of our control. I can't control the weather, but I can control how I will react to the weather. I might not be able to control whether something happens that will make me angry, but I can control whether that anger will take possession of me and cause me to act. I can't control what other people do, but I can control my reaction to that. They use the metaphor that we actually introduced at the very beginning of this course of the archer and the target. When I shoot the arrow at the target, I can control the release of the arrow. I cannot control whether it hits the target. And so the Stoics urged, focus on the inward, focus on what is within our control, and let go of what's outside of our control. A happy life for the Stoics was a life that was lived in accordance with our nature, not a life that fights with our nature. And so if we imagine what the components of that life are, it's a life that is lived rationally, because our nature is fundamentally rational. It's a life that is lived undisturbed by our emotions, in which we fit into our social roles and perform our social duties, another connection to the Gita, in which we are unconcerned with the consequences of our actions and external events. Again, another echo of the Gita. The Stoic sage, then, the person leading this ideal life, is somebody who has natural concerns with the reasonable aims. That is, with aims and objects that are within her control. She attends to social responsibilities. She's not a hermit or a recluse, but no attachments to the results of those activities. She withdraws from emotion, and especially reactions to emotions. That is, she has passions that come upon her. But notice that other term, emotion, something that comes out of us uncontrollably, right? The expression of anger as opposed to the anger. She notes her passions, sets them aside, and does not emote, does not allow these reactions to come outside. She leads a life of reason and a life in human interaction, accepting her own finitude and the inevitability of her death. This is the ideal Stoic life. So if we compare Stoicism to the Gita and to Aristotle, we see that with Aristotle, we have an agreement that our nature is fundamentally rational, fundamentally social, that our passions come from outside, and that our moral life requires a rational control of them. From Aristotle, we inherit the distinction between external and internal goods. But there's a disagreement with Aristotle about the importance of the external. Aristotle thought the external goods were essential to happiness. The Stoic thinks they're irrelevant. With the Gita, we have the shared insight that the most important aspect of our nature is that part of our nature that we share with the divine. For the Gita, of course, that divinity was our ability to act, our ability to perform our svadharma and to be in this kind of union with the cosmos. For the Stoics, it's this kind of rational union. Our social roles are totally essential to the good life for the Stoics, as they are in the Gita. And there's this profound agreement for the need to focus on the internal, not on the external, even though the reasons may be very different. So now I'd like to begin to get more specific about the Stoics, and we're going to focus on this great Stoic philosopher, Seneca. Seneca was a Roman. He was born in Spain sometime around the turn of the millennium, about the same time that Jesus was living. He was educated in Rome and wrote some important works in history. He was from an upper-class family, and he became a Roman senator. He was a very respected orator. He was tutor to the Emperor Nero. Seneca was especially concerned in some of his writings with anger as an example of an emotion. Anger is a great example for a Stoic because it's outward directed. We're angry at somebody and our behavior reflects that outward direction. But it comes upon us as a passion. It seems to overtake us and then motivates action. It's fundamentally irrational, Seneca argued, and it's very powerful. So Seneca focuses on anger as this kind of central case of an emotion for analysis. Why? Well, of course, as we've seen, the rational control of the emotions is central to leading a meaningful life if you're a Stoic. And anger is readily available, right? That is, each of us has experienced it. We can follow the analysis. Moreover, to many of us, anger seems okay. It seems reasonable to be angry in some cases. We talk about righteous anger or justified anger. People talk about getting in touch with their anger. It's also hard to control. And so the question you might ask is, well, what's wrong with anger? Seneca is going to tell us there's a lot wrong with anger. First, he's going to argue that it's hideous, that it's just disgusting. Second, that it's dangerous. It can cause real harm. Third, that it's unnatural. That might strike you as surprising, but remember that for a Stoic, we are fundamentally rational, and anger is irrational, that it's counterproductive, and it's overpowering. And so the question then is, what can we do about it? We're going to see Seneca argue that what we can do is a number of things. We can be skeptical about its causes. We can kind of suspend judgment about why we're angry. We can be a bit more thick-skinned. We can be reflective about our responses to it. We can rise above it. And this will give us the possibility of leading a meaningful life. That is a moderate, happy, useful life. All of this requires self-control. And the great thing about anger is that anger provides us with a great domain to practice self-control. Seneca writes, "Anger is the most hideous and frenzied of all the emotions. The others have something quiet and placid in them, whereas anger is all excitement and impulse, raving with a desire that is utterly inhuman for instruments of pain and reparations in blood. It rushes on to the very spear points, greedy for vengeance that draws down the avenger with it." So here Seneca is emphasizing the violence of anger. He continues, "Anger is brief insanity, oblivious of decency, heedless of personal bonds, obstinate, closed to reasoning or advice, incapable of discerning fairness or truth. It most resembles those ruins which crash in pieces over what they have crushed." Now, Seneca here is emphasizing the violence of anger, but also the destructiveness of anger. The fact that anger doesn't build anything, it doesn't provide benefits, it destroys what's around us. He continues, "Now look at its consequences. No plague has cost the human race more. You will see slaughter, poisoning, charge and sordid countercharge, devastation of cities, the ruin of whole nations." So it's a really terrible thing. Moreover, Seneca argues that it's unnatural. And of course, this might take us as surprising, because we might think that it's natural to become angry at some things. But listen to him on this. He asks, "What is milder than man when he is in his right mind? Man was begot for mutual assistance, anger for mutual destruction. The one seeks to help, the other seeks to harm. Human life rests upon kindness and concord, bound together not by terror, but by love reciprocated." So here we see Seneca resting on the premise that we are basically social animals, that we're designed to live together in societies cooperatively, and that anger hinders that. Anger makes that impossible. So anger runs against our nature because it makes it impossible for us to do what we naturally do, that is, to live together. Seneca also argues that anger is counterproductive. He writes, "Can it really be that anger, although it's not natural, should be adopted because it has proved useful? It rouses and spurs on the mind. Without it, courage can achieve nothing." So here, Seneca is considering the possibility that even though anger is not natural, it might have its uses. It gets up our energy, gets us to do noble deeds, and so forth. But he argues that it's not true. For one thing, he says, you don't need anger. What you need is reason to act effectively. If somebody harms you and you want to redress that harm, you need to think carefully, and anger undermines reason. Anger, he argues, is essentially free fall. You just lose control completely and you have no control over your actions. But if you want to act reasonably, you need control. Emotion cannot be ruled by reason, he argues. Even moderate emotion is just a moderate harm. So anger only inhibits our ability to act effectively. And anybody who thinks that they can cultivate anger and then control it is only fooling themselves. You've got far greater control over your actions, Seneca argues, when you eliminate the emotion and think in a cool, calculating way. As a consequence, Seneca argues, virtue doesn't require vice like anger to be manifested. Vice undermines virtue, and passion like anger is always vicious. He emphasizes its overpowering nature, and here he criticizes Aristotle. Aristotle says that some emotions, if well used, serve as arms. That would be true, writes Seneca, if, like weapons of war, they could be picked up and put down at will. But these arms which Aristotle would give to virtue go to war by themselves. They possess us. They are not our possessions. So even if you thought that anger was a useful thing and kind of motivating you, Seneca points out, it just takes over. So the question then is, what does Seneca advise that we do about anger? What's the therapy for anger? Well, for one thing, he says, we can rise above it. We're often angry because we think life is unfair. We think bad things have happened to us that we don't deserve, kind of like Job. But Seneca points out we often just expect too much of life and too much of others. Our enemies are supposed to harm us, so we shouldn't be surprised when they do. We don't need to act in anger. We can act in calculating redress. And our friends, even when they do bad things to us, remember, they're fallible. People make mistakes, and it's not appropriate to be angry about mistakes. Accidents happen. We should expect a certain amount of misfortune now and then, because the world is a kind of thorny place. And once harm is done, Seneca points out, anger does absolutely nothing to undo it. It's not as though the harm gets undone by the actions of anger. He says, the cause of bad temper is the opinion that we have been wronged. It should not readily be trusted. We should always give ourselves time. Its passing reveals the truth. That is, the point is that oftentimes we find ourselves getting angry because we've misinterpreted the behavior of others or the words of others. We're angry for the wrong reason. Seneca points out that if there really are good reasons to punish somebody, they'll stand the test of examination, and that the punishment will be much more effective if we mete it out calmly. If we mete it out in rage, we're going to punish people immoderately. We might do inappropriate things, things that we later regret, and there's no way that we can take the actions or the words back once they are performed. Anybody who's a parent will recognize the truth of this. And Seneca continues, whenever our suspicions prove to be false, we should reproach our readiness to believe. Such castigation will put us in the habit of not readily believing things. We should remind ourselves of the mistakes we make. Seneca argues that we should be thick-skinned about these things. He says, next in order comes this. Do not be irritated by vulgar trivialities, a clumsy slave or lukewarm water to drink. The couch is a mess, or the table carelessly laid. To be provoked by such things is lunacy. And you know what? If we think about it reflectively, we'll realize that most of the things that provoke us to anger are that trivial. Seneca's pointing that out, that much of our lives are led in the kind of arising of anger that's got no decent cause. Think about road rage, for instance. And Seneca urges us to reflect on the causes of anger. He says, we lose our tempers either with what cannot possibly have done us wrong or with what can. The former includes objects without sensation, like the book which we throw away because the script is too small. His eyes must have been like mine. How stupid it is to be angry with them. They don't deserve our anger, nor can they feel it. So Seneca points out that most often the objects of our anger are totally irrational. We can't control the external world, and it's foolish to be angry when we fail to do so. But the one thing we can control is our emotional reaction to these things. The print might be small, but I don't need to become angry as a result. And emotional reactions just cloud our reason and make it impossible to behave effectively, like, say, to go out and buy some glasses. That's Seneca. So now I'd like to turn to a second Stoic philosopher, Epictetus, who offers some interesting contrasts with Seneca. Whereas Seneca was a Roman aristocrat writing for other aristocrats, Epictetus was a Stoic slave and spent most of his time teaching common people. So he's an unusual character in this tradition. Seneca is more concerned with advice on how to live, but Epictetus was much more concerned with how we should think about the nature of life, more reflective in the big picture, as you might say. Together, they provide us with a nice, complete picture of Stoicism, reflections on the nature of life, and recommendations regarding how to live it. Epictetus argued, as any good Stoic, that we live our lives in interdependence, and that so much that happens to us is completely out of our control because of our interdependence on others and on the inanimate world around us. For that reason, he argued, we should accept the external conditions we find, as well as the harms they cause us, with good cheer. Good cheer because we're rational social beings who have control over our lives and who can think and do philosophy. And we should dedicate ourselves to the collectivities, to the wholes of which we're parts. Think again here about Aristotle. Think also about the Gita. We should behave rationally for the good of the whole, refraining from harming anyone, because again, it's our nature to live with others and to benefit others. And we should always bear in mind our finitude, always bear in mind the inevitability of our death, and so take time seriously and ourselves less seriously. I want to focus on that for a minute. I want to focus on that. The focus on the inevitability of death is one that's very central to Stoic thinking. This emphasis on our finitude, which for some might strike us as depressing. And of course, we saw Job claiming that one of the problems with the world is that our lives are so short and that so little opportunity is there. The Stoics argued that there's nothing wrong with finitude. Finitude is the nature of human life, the nature of reality, and that if we focus on finitude and take it seriously, we will understand how to give our lives more meaning because they're finite, because they're limited. That death isn't a tragedy. Death is an inevitability, and that awareness of our death makes our lives more rich. So now let's look at some of Epictetus' own remarks. Talking about external things and internal phenomena and what we can control, he asks, so what is meant by saying that some externals are according to nature and some contrary to nature? This is said to be so as if we were independent entities. So Seneca is going to reject that idea that some external things are natural and some unnatural. For I'd say, he writes, that it is affording to nature for the foot to be clean. But if you take it as a foot and not as an independent entity, it will be incumbent on it to walk in the mud and to step on thorns. Otherwise, it will no longer be a foot. So you might think, he says, that the nature of a foot is to be clean, because you take a look at your foot after a bath and it's clean. But if you treat that as natural for the foot, then you won't be able to walk on it, because to be a foot is to be the kind of thing that you walk on through mud and thorns and so forth. He draws the analogy now. This is what it is like in our case too. If you look at yourself as an independent entity, it will be according to nature for you to live to old age, to be wealthy, to be healthy. Because of course we would like to be those things. But if you look at yourself as a human being and part of some whole, then for the sake of that whole, it is incumbent on you to get sick at one point, at another to take a dangerous voyage, to die prematurely. So Epictetus points out that if we pay attention to the big picture, our nature is to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. What happened to Job is perfectly natural, not because of who we are as individuals, but because of the whole universe in which we find ourselves. Epictetus emphasizes our social roles. As we're humans, we're rational, unlike animals. We can understand the nature of life and live in harmony with it. We're citizens, parts of communities. We have responsibilities. We're family members with intergenerational relationships, with duties to our parents and to our children. So our identities, like the identity of the foot, are determined by these contexts: universal contexts, national contexts, civic contexts, filial contexts, contexts of friendship. And what we do in these contexts is what gives our lives meaning, not irrational emotions, not self-interested action that takes us to be detached or independent. And then we need to look at what Epictetus says about death. because now we get this real sense of the finitude. And I'm going to read you one of my very favorite passages from all of Stoic philosophy. Epictetus writes, "Go ahead and tell me that harvesting the grain is ill-omened. After all,